Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book. And this week we're starting an exploration of history's favorite bad boy, The Origin of Satan by Elaine Pagels. Video 1. Elaine Pagels is a national treasure. She is Professor Emeritus of Religion at Princeton. She wrote a book that we covered a while ago. I have a playlist if you're interested. The Gnostic Gospels. I really like her work. She is adept at presenting complicated things in a very clear way, and she doesn't get mired in ideology. She tries to step back and look at things from, well, a historical point of view. I find her very interesting. And when I saw this title, I didn't know exactly what track she would take in the book, and I thought, oh, this might be really interesting. It was written in 1995, and it does withstand the test of time. I have enjoyed. I'm not completely finished with it yet. I'm trying to keep a chapter ahead of you guys, but it's very interesting, and I just want to be really clear. This is not validating or denying, accepting or challenging anybody's particular religious point of view. This is looking at written material from the past, studying it within the context of the historical time and place. And as with most things in human history, the passage of time affects how these things are seen. We read these things, we look at the historical events within the context of our own reality. And so historians, their big challenge is to step out of that and try to give it perspective. So trying to maintain a sense of perspective about religious beliefs can be difficult, because anybody who is deeply committed to a belief system has usually a sense of resistance to anything that feels like a challenge. So this is not meant to be critical or negating or a challenge. It's meant to present these things in the actual historical context, which oftentimes we're not aware of the human manipulation that has gone on. It's really interesting. I hope you're going to enjoy this. So Elaine Pagels is much better at explaining these things than I am. So let's begin with the introduction. And she starts out talking about her husband died in a tragic accident, hiking or camping or something, mountain climbing, something like that, in 1988. And she said that the loss of a loved one, it confronts us with the grief of their absence. And humans have struggled from the beginning of time to understand the realities of life, death, and the reality of the physical world. So, we understand that the ancients attributed it to gods and goddesses and destiny and fate. And I would caution, I think we tend to minimize the intellectual capacity of people in the past because they lived a long time ago. They were just that much more stupid than we are, and that nothing could be farther from the truth. There have been cycles of wisdom, gained and lost, gained and lost. It's really important to remember that. Today, we're more likely to call what happens, the grief, the loss, human nature, or ascribe it to the forces of nature. The ancients believed that there was an invisible world inhabited by unseen beings that interact with our world. And some people still believe that. For some traditions, monotheistic traditions, rather than having multiple gods, they describe a binary situation where you've got a God and God's opposite, demons, angels and demons, God and the devil, the chief demon. We're going to talk about how that evolved. How do we get from all these complicated, for example, Sumerian or Greek and Roman or Egyptian gods and goddesses who displayed the full range of human frailties and strengths? How do we get from there to this polar opposite, perfect God and perfectly evil devil? How did we get there? To change religions, to convert from one belief system to another, it necessitates redefining the invisible world. So we often go through these processes or rituals or belief systems in our modern lives. We don't think about their origins. So, for example, in Christianity, there's baptism. And if you've ever been to a baptism, they ask, like if you're doing a Catholic baptism, the godmother and the godfather speak for the baby. And they're asked, do you, speaking for the baby, do you renounce the devil and all his works? And, you know, nobody gets into an argument at the baptismal font, you know, and they say, yes, we do renounce him, and off you go. Pagans required declaring former divinities of other belief systems to be demons who were hostile to their particular gods or their particular entities like angels. Converting to Judaism required moralizing the entire universe. For example, Sodom and Gomorrah, they were punished by God for being evil, the whole place. The events in the natural world that happened to people were viewed through the lens of divine judgment. But Pagel discovered that early Christians who blamed not God's will, they didn't say, oh, God is punishing us. Like if you did something really bad, like if there was a plague or a war, something terrible happened to a large group of people, in Judaism, they would say, well, that's God punishing everybody. But the early Christians, they were not into that. They didn't say God's punishing everybody. They said this is caused by the evil of the Satans. It's malevolence. They seemed more concerned about the nature of human relationships too. It wasn't just the caprice of these powerful entities. In the Hebrew Bible, there were plenty of angels, but not really Satans or demons. And I mean small s, plural, Satans. And we're going to talk about that, actually demons. In the first century, some groups of people like the Essenes, they allied themselves with angels, and as contrast, they developed this notion of a satanic figure, the devil, I guess, and it's mentioned in the Gospels of Mark, who describes Jesus in a struggle with God's spirit against the demons. Christ was tempted in the desert by Satan, but really the translation is the Satan, because he was a demon, one of many demons. In this way, Christians identified with God. They were the good guys. And people who didn't identify as Christians, they were the bad guys. They were their ideological opponents. So that would include anybody, the Israelites, any other Jews who didn't agree with them, pagans, heretics, which is their kind of umbrella title for any other Christian sect that didn't think the same way they did. So, and that was a growing problem. So you had a new conflict being created. No longer was it, as in Judaism, God punishing bad people, but you had bad people and good people pitted against each other, defined by who their God was. And if you didn't identify with the particular God of the group, then you identified with the devil. So this book concentrates on the stories of betrayal and killing and hostility around demonic demons. Satan is this umbrella term that expresses qualities that are way beyond the usual sins of our worst impulses, even worse than brutality. It's like the ultimate evil. According to some, but not all, as we will see, he was a fallen angel in open rebellion against God. Many claim to see his intense spiritual passion. They see Satan struggling spiritually. And they see individuals or groups that use our best qualities to be, the good guys. And the bad guys are the people who lead you away from that towards destruction. And they're taking pleasure in inflicting harm. So we're doing what we now call demonizing others. And we're going to talk a lot about that. Evil involves the supernatural and the various figures of Satan, the Satans, plural. Belial, Mastema, Beelzebub, Lucifer. These characters were all individual Satans. They sprang from the turmoil of first century Palestine, where and when the first Christian movement grew. This book is about the social implications of the Satans, how Satan is invoked to express human conflict, to characterize human enemies within our own traditions. As in, he's a real devil, that kind of thing. So consider Satan a reflection of how we see others. It's our negative view of other people who don't agree with us. Many people think in this binary way: good, evil, them, us. We often think others bad, us good. It's very primitive brain, and this is not in the book, I'm just making this observation, that our primitive brain absolutely, subconsciously, without our understanding that that's what's happening, impels us often to do this. This is something that we have to rise above, this primitive nature in our very early brain, part of our brain. It is where the expression pecking order comes from. Birds, chickens, for example, they will select out any individual in the group who's different. Sick, weak, smaller, different color. Like if you put a mixed bunch of chickens, like we've got several different kinds of chickens of several different ages. And we always have to be careful introducing the new ones to the established ones, because they will select out the different and they will peck them. It's a hierarchy of similarity. And the more different you are, the lower you are in the hierarchy, and they will go after the one that's deemed most vulnerable and kill it. So these distinctions happen in human nature. We are animals. They're very clear. You can see them very clearly. We probably don't recognize them in ourselves, but you see them very clearly in early cultures, early languages. The repulsion and the interest, them and us, that's reflected in language. In ancient Egyptian, the word Egyptian means human, as opposed to everybody who's not Egyptian. And in ancient Greek, non-Greeks were called barbarians. So there's a sense it seems like the human trait is to dehumanize others. Yes, it's kind of a primitive thing because we think that others aren't human. And it helps us define and consolidate our own group identification. So it serves two purposes. It identifies who's different, but it reasserts our solidarity with those of us who are alike. Society does not simply discover in its others, it fabricates them. Societies decide who the others are by selecting, isolating, and emphasizing an aspect of another people's life and making it symbolize their difference. Since I'm Irish, I'm going to use that example so that I don't offend anybody. But you know, the Irish, they're all drunks. That's an example. Stereotyping a group of people to minimize their value, but to also identify your social group as not them. Conflict in Christianity uses Satan to represent a moral and religious interpretation. We are God's people and they are the enemies of God. They align with Satan, the bad guy, and therefore they are our enemies. It's a moral interpretation of conflict. Jesus in the New Testament said, whoever kills you will think he is offering a service to God. He warned his followers, be careful, because your enemies will think that if they harm you, they're serving God. So, you know, he had a good grip on social biology. So this attitude was effective in consolidating the identification of Christian groups. It justified hatred and the mass slaughter of groups that were not us. And Pagels recognized this sort of demonizing of the other throughout history. It seems to be a real human thing. For example, for 2,000 years, many Christians believe, and okay, so I have to say this for the sake of YouTube, for the sake of anybody who may take offense, do not be offended by this. I have no particular beef with anybody, but we're going to be talking about historical attitudes. And please don't mistake me talking about the belief systems of other people as me talking about myself. I'm not, well, if I side with somebody, I'll let you know, but I'm not demonizing. There's that word. I'm not demonizing anybody. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm telling you what attitudes of people were historically. And I hope this covers the bases for YouTube, but I may have to repeat this again. So 2,000 years ago, many Christians were under the impression that the Jews of the time, like the traditional ones, killed Jesus, and that the Romans were reluctantly involved. Now, there's a reason why they thought that, and we're going to discuss this in depth later. Just file that in the back of your mind. There's an implication of evil even for the progeny of people who come from a group. So Christians, early Christians, they associated evil with the members of the Jewish community who did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. So they put the blame on their own people who didn't agree with them ideologically. People took for granted this was historically accurate, you know, modern people as time went by, and they took for granted the historical accuracy and religious validity of the Gospels. But we have found out otherwise with time. For example, accuracy is questionable because accuracy might not have been the priority of the authors of these works, as we'll see. Gospel stories were woven into or with older prophetic writing. They often manipulated passages to prove that Jesus fulfilled those old prophecies. We'll talk more about that. The Gospel of Mark is anything but a straightforward historical narrative. I mean, that's just, if you can set aside your particular devotion to a belief system and just look at it with an impartial eye to the historical accuracy, it is really clear that these things were not historical documents of any sort. The Gospel of Mark is a theological treatise in the form of an historical biography. The earliest Gospels were written more than one generation after Jesus's death, and others were written 2 generations later. And these people did not later evangelists, guys who wrote the gospel, they did not, they never met Jesus. So it's impossible to determine what's authentic in these gospels without getting independent evidence. And often independent evidence puts their accuracy into question. So the Gospels basically claim that Satan, as like a single evil entity, inspired the Jews in Jerusalem to kill Jesus. And there is a very interesting and complicated historical set of events and dynamics that are probably the true story. And it's impossible to know now, but it is very interesting. And we're going to cover that. Pagel describes research supporting and denying a number of points in this story of the Gospel of Mark. For example, details in there about the Sanhedrin, which were the I don't know what's the right word, the council, the leading official council of the Jewish people within the temple. Other histories point to the Romans as executing Jesus just because of politics. So this debate becomes circular. It becomes impossible to really suss out the exact answer, because maybe there is not an exact answer. It might have been a confluence of convenient mutual need to have this guy gone. Pagel tends to agree that the Romans saw Jesus as a seditious person. So we're not, and she's very clear about this, we're not taking these writings as the gospel. We're not taking them as historical documents. We can't do that. That would be like me sitting down and writing a biography of, who could I? Abbie Hoffman. I heard of him. I know about the things he thought and did. I never met him. Unfortunately, I can't say that I'm a follower of him, but I don't have a particular axe to grind about him. I have some preconceived notions. And if I were to sit down now and write out for you the story of Abbie Hoffman, according to Helen, it would be wholly inaccurate. It would be at best partial and probably very faulty, very flawed. And I think that's how we have to look at this. We have to be fair about it. And these are not rigorously researched documents. They're not written in contemporary time with the people involved, the characters involved in the stories. They're written with an agenda, and you have to know what that agenda is and understand the agenda of the people in the stories to figure out what's really going on. And this doesn't, in my mind anyway, this doesn't make on one level, because there's a whole philosophical argument here underlying everything that we're probably not even going to touch very much. But it doesn't throw out anybody's belief. You know, if you choose to believe these things and to take them as truthful, then that's, you know, that's your right, and we're not trying to change people's minds. What we're trying to do here, what she's trying to do here, is to explain as closely as possible, because it's not entirely possible, just to explain the reality of the historical, cultural, social origins of all of these stories. And I think that gives them nuance and makes them more interesting. I think some people might feel threatened by this. I don't think we need to be. I think it gives them a depth that a superficial reading of them doesn't provide. So, as I said, these Gospels were written 1 to 2 or more generations after the events. It's impossible to say what's authentic because we have no evidence. We don't have enough evidence. So the Gospels claim that Satan inspired the Jews to kill Jesus, and Pagels says the research doesn't support or deny anything specifically. Some points to the guilt of the Romans. So the debate you just can get tangled in this debate. She tends to agree that the Romans saw Jesus as seditious, that his teachings, although not necessarily, but we can't be sure, intended to be political activism, did rev up demonstrations and the mobs that sort of got, enthusiastic about him because they thought he was going to be literally the new king. This really alarmed the Jewish leaders. They could see the writing on the wall. Hey, you're going to piss off the Romans. This is not a good thing. They knew they were outnumbered and outweaponed. And so there was probably, as we'll see, some sort of compromise that was come to between some of the Jewish leaders and some of the Romans. So Pagel tells the sources, she talks about the sources as being too fragmentary. We just do not have enough solid, verifiable information. She wants to show how the Gospels show the movement around Jesus and how it emerged out of first century factionalism. She wants to show how the gospel stories of Jesus and his actions against his, quote unquote enemies correlated with the supernatural drama that was being encouraged people to believe, the struggle between God and Satan. Christians align themselves with God and with Jesus and his disciples, good. And their opponents, people who disagreed, who were not part of the Christian sect, whether or not they were Jewish, didn't matter. They were Satan's demons. They were evil. And this really morphed into something we all know, right? So now that was the introduction. We're just getting started here. So chapter 1, the Gospel of Mark and the Jewish War. 66 CE, the Christian era, Common Era, Christian era, AD, Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. I tend to go with AD because that's just how I was taught. Forgive me if I slip into the old form. But the year 66. So 66 years after, technically, the birth of Christ. There was a Jewish revolt against Rome, and the high priests, the chief priests, and the hierarchy of that particular family line sided with the Romans. And they did it for a variety of reasons. They didn't want to shake up the status quo. They knew they were outnumbered. They thought it was better the enemy you knew than the, why rattle the cage of the bear? They just didn't want to go there. The revolutionaries, the revolters, they believed that God was on their side. And therefore, these highly placed Jews, including the high priest and the high priest's noble wine, that they were the enemy. Now, once again, for YouTube, this is the words of historians about the year 66. I'm not expressing a personal opinion. 3 years later, Vespasian, soon to be emperor, and his son, Titus, who was later emperor, plus a few odd 60,000 Roman soldiers, they marched into Jerusalem. Now, this is scary. This is the year 69, so the real destruction was in the year 70. The Romans were the most formidable military in the world. And so we hear about it in detail 20 years later by a guy nicknamed Josephus. His full name was Flavius Josephus. He was the former governor of Galilee at the age of 30. He was from a priestly Jewish family, and he fought against Rome. He was a partisan, and he wrote the only extant history of the war. This is the only for sure documentation we have of this Roman incursion into Jerusalem against the Israelites. Josephus, at the age of 26, he went to Rome trying to pacify, to intercede with Nero. He met Nero's wife. I thought, this is really interesting. There's more to this story than we've been told. Her name is Poppaea. She agreed to help Josephus, to intercede with her crazy husband on behalf of the Jews in Jerusalem. So this is what he said in his autobiography about this. I found revolutionary movements already begun and great excitement at the prospect of revolt from Rome. Accordingly, I tried to stop those preaching sedition, urging them to place before their eyes those against whom they were fighting and to remember that they were inferior to the Romans, not only in military skill, but in good fortune. Although earnestly and insistently seeking to dissuade them from their purpose, foreseeing the results would be disastrous for us, I did not persuade them. The great insanity of those desperate men prevailed. So he paints a picture of a people at the end of their rope rebelling against authoritarian power, and he tried to calm them down using logic, and that never works when you're talking to people who are at the end of their rope and emotionally overwrought. So that approach was doomed to fail, of course. So he went back, he went to Judea, and Judea is Palestine. So I could not help but think the whole time I was reading this book, again, So the whole area of Palestine was in turmoil. There was a guerrilla leader called John of Giscala. He went to Jerusalem with the intention of rallying a revolt of the people against the Romans, and he got tens of thousands to join him. Older people tended to oppose revolution. They were like, look, set aside your heated emotion and realize that you're doomed to failure here. Let's try to use our brains and not our emotions. But John, with his followers, his revolutionaries, they captured Antipas, who was the Jewish city treasurer, and two other guys connected to the Jewish royal dynasty. They called them traitors, and Josephus went on at the age of 30 to be governor, as we said, of Galilee, still against revolution. And he was pressured and pressured and pressured and pressured. And at first he sort of pretended to go along because he didn't know what to do. He was stuck between the two sides. Actually, even once he narrowly escaped death in a Roman massacre. He was able to hide. He was captured by the Romans from his hiding spot. He was taken before Vespasian. And he told Vespasian that God had told Josephus himself that Vespasian would someday be emperor. Vespasian thought, okay, this is a trick to escape punishment, but I like what he's saying, and threw him back in prison. Well, within a few months, Nero was killed. He was poisoned. And Nero died at his own hand. And three others fell. Three other potential emperors, one after the other fell. And just by attrition, Vespasian became emperor. And when he became emperor, his first act was to free Josephus from prison. And Josephus became part of Vespasian's entourage, his posse, as it were, as interpreter and mediator. So he acted as a liaison between his own people and the Romans. He went back to Jerusalem with Titus when Titus was put in charge of the Roman military. So Josephus in his writing describes three factions in this battle. The priests who just wanted peace. They did not want to fight. They had a good thing going. They knew they were outnumbered. They didn't want to fight. The revolutionaries who came from the countryside, and they were hot. They were ready to fight. And then the anti-Roman men of greatest power who wanted to be the most powerful over the rebels. These are like the urban rebels who thought they were better than the country rebels. So even before the Romans showed up, they had these three different factions of Israelites, Judeans, fighting against each other. And Josephus was kind of stuck in the middle. He could see the insanity of taking on the Roman military and Roman Empire, unlimited resources, trained, calculated, against people who couldn't even agree with each other, heated for various reasons, letting their emotions drive them, completely untrained. So his own people hated him as a traitor. The Romans blamed him for treason. Every time there was a military setback, they blamed him for not doing enough. So he describes Jerusalem under siege, under blockade, under famine, and there's some seriously gruesome stories. I will spare you if you can find them. They're out there, but it was a terrible situation. The Romans tortured any age if they stole food. It was bad. As was really inevitable, the army overcame the city. Titus and his staff led the charge. They went to the temple, into the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. This was a huge desecration. And it's also where the treasury was kept. The soldiers looted the treasury. They set the temple on fire. They desecrated the ground that night after the fire died down by sacrificing to their own gods on the site of the Jewish temple. They did what you think they would do. Think Berlin under Soviet occupation in 1945. They pillaged, they looted, they massacred thousands. They left the city just completely taken to the ground, rubble. 15 years later, in his, as the book so drolly puts it, in his Roman retirement villa, Josephus wrote this. "O most wretched city, what misery so great as this did you suffer from the Romans when they came to purify you from your internecine hatred." So he points to the dissension amongst the Jews of Jerusalem as why the Romans came. Interesting. So it's true that there was division, divisive factions, devastation. All of that is true. So the first Christian gospel that's accepted was written during the last year of the war. It's anonymous, but it's attributed to Mark, but nobody knows for sure. Just, we'll call it the Gospel according to Mark. The author took sides in the war. The author of the Gospel, whoever he was, we'll call him Mark. He took sides in the war. He wrote about Jesus as a charismatic teacher who was executed by Pilate, the governor of Judea, for sedition against Rome. That had happened like 35 years previous to the writing of this. No surviving account of any of this was contemporaneous with Jesus's life. There is nothing. Nothing that's been officially accepted. We will get to that. Many accounts were written from retold stories, but not by anybody who actually knew him. So these stories by word of mouth and written elsewhere got passed down, passed down, passed down. It's like a game of telephone. There were numerous accounts, as we later found out, and very much later, almost 2,000 years later, we found out. But only 4 are in the official New Testament. Josephus and Tacitus is how you say Tacitus, who was a Roman senator in 115 AD. So unless he was very, very old, he didn't meet Jesus. They wrote about all of this with contempt and hostility. And they all put Jesus in the middle of the trouble in Judea. So the earliest Gospel of Mark says that Jesus was arrested by the Romans as a robber. And so here is where translation starts to matter, because the actual word from the original was a catch-all word. It meant, troublemaker. Didn't necessarily mean he was stealing something. It meant that he was a thorn in the Roman side, either intentionally or inadvertently. Josephus used the same term for any of the Jews of Jerusalem who were against Rome. Interesting. Jewish leaders handed Jesus over. They did, and they accused him of claiming to be the king of the Jews as their excuse for arresting him. That's blasphemy, right? The Romans used him as an example and a warning to other would-be rebels, whether or not they considered him to be a legitimate problem. The chief high priest of the temple and his followers, the Sanhedrin, they considered him a problem because whether he intended or we just don't know for sure whether or not he intended to rile up the people were riled up. They thought, oh, you're king of the Jews. So he didn't say that, but it was said of him. And so people were like, oh, good. Now we're going to get rid of the Romans. They rallied around. The Jewish leaders saw the writing on the wall. So did the Romans. They didn't like any, fomenting problems. Make this guy an example and get rid of him. It'll be a lesson to everybody. It'll get rid of the problem. It's all good. That was kind of what happened. So the stories that eventually ended up in the Gospel of Mark were originally personal narratives of certain followers of Jesus who were under suspicion and trying to spin the story and not look guilty. The New Testament Gospels are wartime literature. You know what they say about history. It's written by the winners, right? Gospels of Mark were written at the end or shortly after the end of this drawn out, protracted war, which, the year 70 is the pivotal destruction of the temple. Well, Jesus wasn't around. John, the Gospel of John, it was written in Alexandria about one generation after the war, about 95 to 100 CE. Paul of Tarsus, Gospels, his writing, he wrote before the war, and he knew nothing of Jesus or the war. He wasn't around for that. Paul wasn't interested in a biography of Jesus. He was interested in the religious symbolism of Jesus as an atonement and sacrifice. He was more into the philosophical stuff rather than biographical accuracy. And he seemed to ignore Josephus's claim that Jesus was a troublemaker. But nevertheless, Paul was executed in 65 CE, before it all came down in Jerusalem. He was executed in Rome. The war shattered the center of the Jewish world, Jerusalem, and the hardships after the war exacerbated old divisions within all these scattered Jewish communities. These divisions had existed for more than 200 years. She goes into a big, detailed story of the Maccabees, who helped to restore the Jewish state after, I believe, well, I'm not going to say, I think the Syrian, I'm not going to say, I don't know enough. But essentially what matters is that the politics of Jewish leaders was just disarray. And the followers of Jesus were polarized in relationship to other Jewish communities. They were all offended that other Jews in their circle did not recognize Jesus as the Messiah. They refused to fight. The followers of Jesus refused to fight because they took it all as a sign of the end times after Christ was crucified. So now remember, the fight came after Jesus died. And they were like, well, we're not getting involved in this because it's end times anyway. Mark and the Christians' followers believed that Jesus had predicted all of this. Some said the destruction of the temple was God's punishment for rejecting the Messiah. So this is a very traditional Jewish attitude about good and evil. Bad things happen because God is punishing you. Not because the devil is out to get you, but because God is punishing you. Subtle, but it's a different attitude. Jesus's followers, they weren't against the Romans. They were against the other Jewish leaders. The Sanhedrin and the scribes and the priests. These are the top hierarchical guys. These same groups rejected Mark and his fellow believers. They said he was insane. And then they said he was possessed by demons. Mark blamed the Jewish leaders for Christ's death, and he exonerated the Romans. He paints a picture of Pilate to be a well-meaning weakling who was afraid of the Jewish priests and the crowds, kind of stuck in the middle, trying to just get out of it. But there's a different picture of Pilate, a much different picture of Pilate. Josephus said that Pilate showed contempt for the Jews, that he was there to govern, that he stole treasury money, that he brutally suppressed the crowds, that he was really brutal. Philo, who was a member of the Alexandrian Jewish community, said this. described Pilate as a man of ruthless, stubborn, and cruel disposition, famous for, among other things, ordering frequent executions without trials. Mark wanted the Romans to think the Christians were not a threat, so he was trying to pour oil over troubled water. He wanted to convert Gentiles, but mostly he was interested in the conflict within the Jewish community, especially those who rejected Jesus. So there's a lot going on here. Mark was all about the good news, but if it was so good, how come the movement failed? That's a legitimate question. How come the followers all went into hiding? How come Jesus was captured? They're talking in Jesus's time. Wasn't Jesus a seditionist? These are all questions that came up after the fact. Mark couches all of this not in the context of politics. He presents this as a big battle between good and evil. Jesus good, everybody else evil. He claimed Jesus was challenging the forces of evil that dominated the world, that he came up against the Romans because he was driven to it by God, and the Romans were evil. They concocted this view of the whole situation as Satan and other demons retaliating against God by working together to destroy Jesus. Mark claimed that Satan was after Jesus from the time he encountered him in the desert. They fought. Satan bad, Jesus good, Jesus won. Now keep in mind that there's been a gradual morphing of the word Satan. Originally it meant small s, plural, Satans, little demons, little entities that could cause trouble. But they morphed into these big figures. Matthew and Luke, now we're moving on to the second generation of gospel writers. They created more elaborate stories around all this. Luke said that Satan came as Judas Iscariot. Others said that Jesus took Judas aside and told him, you have to do this. This is the role you need to play in order for my fate to play out. All the writing of the New Testament paints a picture of Jesus's life and death as a struggle between good and evil. They wanted to look beyond his death to a greater cosmic conflict and kept the story going, extended it farther. And to do that, this big final battle between good and evil, it's always imminent. It's always just down the road. The apocalypse, it's going to be any day now. Jesus said so, according to the New Testament, written by people who didn't know him. So they had an agenda. Mark was not repeating history. He was trying to show people the future of the world. And, if you didn't follow Jesus, that there was a supernatural conflict from old Jewish apocalyptic literature, and he gave it a new narrative. Jesus's death was not the victory of evil. It was the announcing of the ultimate annihilation of evil and God's final victory. So after his death and the ruin of the temple, the Jewish followers of Jesus asked, how could God allow such death and destruction of the temple and Jerusalem? Mark said that divine justice always involves human violence because evil works through people, making your enemies evil. He interprets human conflict in supernatural form. Therefore, your enemies are Satan and the embodiment of transcendent forces. Us and them. God against Satan. This vindicates Christians and it demonizes everybody else. It's a very convenient way to characterize the whole thing. The New Testament doesn't identify Satan with Romans. It identifies Satan with Jesus's Jewish enemies, especially Judas and the high priests and the scribes, and the majority of their fellow Jews who didn't accept the Messiah. So let me see here. How are we doing? Who were Jesus's enemies? If we're going to have to characterize them. So that would be the Roman government, the Roman authorities, the Roman soldiers. They were ruthless in their suppressing of sedition, very much like the SS, very much. And there were routine roundups and executions, often without trial. Capricious. But in Jerusalem, the priests and the influential allies, the Jewish elite, they felt threatened by Jesus's activities just as much as the Romans did, for different reasons. But they felt this guy walking around preaching about my kingdom is at hand. He's causing us grief with these Roman occupiers. His followers, Jesus's followers, wrote about him as outsiders. They didn't know him. They didn't identify with Jewish leaders. They agreed, excuse me, if they had agreed with the Jewish majority, they would have seen Jesus as a holy man, martyred by traditional foreign oppressor enemies and nothing more. The Gospels, they dissociate from the Jewish majority. They're focused on the inter-Jewish conflict, especially whoever doesn't accept the Messiah. They're more concerned about that than they are about the Romans. They minimize the Romans' role, and they begin to equate fellow Jews with Satan, the enemies of Jesus. This is where this is coming. So this narrative that, okay, now these are the words of the Gospel of Mark, and these are not my words. I'm not saying this is true, YouTube, but this false narrative, false as much as we'll know, that the Jews of the time, the Jewish community who did not accept Jesus as a Messiah, were the ones who killed him. This created the ability to equate fellow Jews with Satan, the enemies of Jesus. So you see how that natural progression worked. They went from all being one community to some people being lured into following this sect that followed Jesus. And then they turned around and saw their fellows as enemies because they didn't follow Jesus. Because somehow, us good, them bad, us God, them Satan. That's the very basic what happened. They knew that the Romans were still looking for sedition, and this put those loyal to Jesus at risk because, he was executed by the Romans and he was seditious. Mark, in part, tried to portray them as not a threat to Rome. He tried very hard to paint a picture of the Jewish people as their name, nothing to worry about here. He relates human conflicts with a struggle between God and Satan. He puts Jesus early against the temple authorities. I mean, at the age of 12, he was teaching the high priests in the temple. This had a lot of weight for those who heard it at the time of the story, even though it was a long time after Jesus had died, to be told, this guy was teaching the priests. Well, who did he think he was? Mark said that Jesus came to heal the world. He did miracles outside of the sanction of the temple priests. This gave him greater authority over the priests and power in the eyes of some people. It set him against the scribes and priests. They were the big shots. And then he drove out demons. And this angered the scribes by claiming the right to speak for God. I mean, he was an upstart, would be the best word. According to Mark, Jesus, aware of the scribe's reaction, immediately performs a healing to prove his authority to his critics. Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they, the scribes, questioned within themselves, said, "Why do you question thus in your heart? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, rise, take your pallet, and go home." And the sick guy rose, picked up his pallet, and went out, so that they were all astonished, saying, "We never saw anything like this." So, yeah. So Jesus at first sounded like the Essenes. They withdrew into caves and they protested conventional, traditional Jewish life. They denounced the authority of the priests and the elite, and they called them hopelessly corrupted by Gentile ways and by collaboration with the Gentiles. Let's see here. I don't want to. Okay. I'm going to stop here because it's as good a place as any to stop. When we come back, we'll be talking once again about the Essenes. So that's the end of video number 1. I think this book raises so many interesting questions, and the history of it is so interesting. So I hope you're enjoying it. Let me know, in the comments. Let me know if you like it, and I'll be back with more Slonkerfoil. Slancha.